I want to talk to you about the apartheid claim. Can you kind of give us an overview of the history of that claim? Where did that come from? Is it new? Is it old? And why is that claim being made?
And the Soviet Union was challenged or criticized or attacked for anti-Semitism. This was the period of after Stalin and post-Stalin. In the United Nations frameworks, talking about human rights violations or the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Soviet response was always, you're supporting Israel. Israel's an apartheid state. Israel's a racist state. Zionism is racism. And so all these terms were very frequently heard in the United Nations beginning in the 1960s. And it wasn't just Soviet delegates and representatives, also the Arab League, number of states and countries, as they were accepted into the UN, that became a dominant theme. And you had, in 1975, the UN adopted this, the UN General Assembly, this resolution said Zionism is racism. The term apartheid was mixed in with all of that all the time. And then it came back up again at the 2001 United Nations sponsored Durban Conference Against Racism. In the final declaration of the NGO Forum, 1,500 organizations, 5,000 delegates in the stadium, by a voice vote, which was not a vote at all, adopted a final declaration and plan of action that used the terms that singled out Israel and said Israel is a racist apartheid state, also guilty of ethnic cleansing and genocide. All that language was in there. We didn't hear that much about it outside of those frameworks, but it became a much more emphasized theme. It became amplified about over the last 5 or 6 years, toward the end of the 2018, 2019, we began to see NGOs. It looks like, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it looks like, and the NGOs do work together as a network. One NGO after another came out with a report, first Israeli NGOs, Palestinian NGOs, and then Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. Big reports, Israel is an apartheid state. And those got, when it comes up to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they get headlines in the New York Times and the BBC and every place else. There's no concrete evidence. There's no evidence that shows that Israel, with an Arab minority, in the middle of a conflict involving a lot of Arab states, has imposed specific criteria that qualify under the definition of apartheid. That's a bogus argument. It's so bogus, in fact, that when they issued the reports, Amnesty in particular, they had to change the language and they had to say, we're using a different definition of apartheid. Human Rights Watch had it at the beginning, where it's not exactly the same as the apartheid in South Africa, but it still qualifies as apartheid. You know, this is bells and whistles, or whatever the right term is, for a totally bogus type of definition. Why use the term if you're talking about something that's not from South Africa? It's because you want to tar Israel with that language and the image, because most people won't read that little caveat that says we're not talking about South African apartheid. Yes, Israel has a large Arab and Muslim minority, and there are restrictions, but they don't have separate drinking fountains. They go to Israeli schools, they participate, they're voted in the Knesset roughly in proportion to the population size. They all have the right to vote. There's no apartheid.
They go to university.
They go to universities, roughly in the same percentage.
Serve on the Supreme Court of Israel?
There's usually at least one judge and it's not a token position. Mm-hmm. There are judges throughout the system. And there are arguments about whether they are biased or not biased, and that's all part of a legitimate Israeli democratic process. To call that apartheid is to single out Israel. And when they're confronted, the NGOs will say, oh, we've used the term, we used it in Myanmar or a couple of other places. But there's no comparison. There are many countries that have majority and minority populations that are countries that are called nation states, not the United States or Canada or Australia, but throughout Europe. And they have minorities, and there are frictions. That doesn't make it apartheid. There's no attempt whatsoever by NGOs to take a set of criteria and say, what's apartheid, what's not apartheid, who fits in and who doesn't. We're going to use this against Israel is the way the process works.
So changing definitions in order to apply things to Israel without really informing everyone that the definition has changed. It's really interesting because, right, I'm a law professor, and applying rules to facts, that's what lawyers do. We apply rules to facts. We are not allowed to change the rules depending on the factual scenario that we want to apply them to. And yet I've even had conversations. I had a conversation with a law professor colleague of mine about the claim that Israel is committing genocide. And, I explained the definition of genocide, applied it to the facts of this current war to demonstrate conclusively that Israel is not committing genocide. And the response I got was, well, I'm not really using that definition. And right, and this was coming from another law professor, which is especially troubling. It actually makes me think about what are the consequences of the ways in which NGOs and then academics and other groups, media, like you said, this whole eighth front, what are the consequences, the way that we are now like kind of accepting these new definitions that have been invented so as to demonize Israel? What happens if we apply those definitions to other conflicts? Like, is that something that you're concerned about?
First of all, the NGO world and the UN, and then from there all the other levels, including your academic colleagues, they don't do that. And that's the biggest problem. They are not applying a rule universally to many different cases and examining the outcome. We're going to look at Israel, and then sometimes you get a comment like, well, you have to start somewhere. We'll always start with Israel, right? Start anywhere you want, but do a broad analysis. Take a set of criteria. Oh, that's too hard. So it comes down to a, not just disproportionate, but I would call it a pathological focus on Israel. As soon as you put the category out there, you're going to be able to find or make up evidence to say, well, this fits close enough, we're going to call it, and we're going to change the definition, exactly the kind of scenario that you described. One of the questions that I ask when I have these discussions is, on what basis, what is the substantive basis? You're going to tell me you read the Amnesty report, 200 and something, I don't remember how many pages, Human Rights Watch report? Did you read the synopsis? Did you read the social media posts? How much have you, this is a serious charge, because South African apartheid was evil, and the regime had no right to exist on any moral basis. If you're saying Israel is an apartheid state, you're saying Israel has no right to exist. That is a very serious allegation. A country, population of 9 million people, is different than all the other 190 countries in the world and has no right to exist. On what basis are you making that claim? Same thing, exactly the same thing with genocide. If you're going to make that claim, you better have a very serious, substantial argument to back it up. They don't exist. It's part of a demonization, whether it's NGOs or the United Nations or academics who make those allegations. They're not subject to the same type of scrutiny that one would expect from other frameworks, from other organizations. You know, in a business framework, if a company makes a claim and the claim is shown to be false, there's a penalty for that. In the academic world, if an article uses false evidence, there's a penalty for that, at least there's supposed to be. In the NGO world, there are no penalties for making false claims. They just continue to repeat and amplify that. That's a serious, serious defect.
Many people have deep respect for organizations that protect human rights. And so if they hear that Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or one of many other organizations says that Israel is an apartheid state, or that Israel is committing genocide, or that Israel is starving the people of Gaza, they absolutely 100% believe it. You're telling us, and all of the information and evidence that your team is gathering is showing us that those claims are false. Why do people believe those organizations?
There's a phenomenon, the term halo effect is often used, which automatically grants organizations that either in the past have been known to act morally, to be based on all sorts of fundamental principles, ethical principles, that give them, it's not even a benefit of the doubt, to consider them to be more ethical, more moral than the business world or politics and government. In fact, that's really one of the basic reasons that NGOs provide, tell their donors, tell others, give us money, give us power, give us authority, give us influence, because we are impartial. That's called the halo effect. Because that's bought and really implemented. Very few journalists ask the question when they feature Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or one of the other hundreds of organizations. Is this organization, in fact, ethically, morally, and substantively what it claims to be? Should we give them the benefit of the doubt? Almost very few investigations of organizations. How did they get all this money? Who funds them? There are lots of cover-ups, too. There are cases where staff members of organizations, many cases, will say there's sexual harassment, there's impropriety, there's corruption. Gets almost no coverage. That's also the halo effect. So when an organization like that says Israel is guilty of committing genocide, is an apartheid state, deliberately starving Palestinians, all of those things. The halo effect protects the organizations from being examined the way any other organization should be. If a politician said that, in most places, there would be at least a debate, there would be open platforms to criticize them. The NGO world has somehow been given immunity because of that halo effect.
So for months, it was in the media that there was a famine in Gaza and that Gazans were starving. And that message was definitely being delivered to the media by non-governmental organizations. And then it was being parroted by government officials, I think even Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Was it ever true?
There's no evidence that Palestinians are starving in Gaza, that there's a lack of food or water in a substantial way, which causes them to die in the numbers that the NGOs, and then repeated in media platforms one after the other, and by political figures, officials, that in fact this was the case. Human Rights Watch and Oxfam issued a joint report, which they officially submitted to the US government, and somewhere in the early 2024, saying, yeah, there's a starvation going on. They had lots of graphs and statistics to say this is obviously starvation. They quoted various other bodies. NGOs tend to quote other NGOs. They quoted, a lot of the footnotes went to their own previous reports. It turned out to be entirely bogus. Nobody's going back now and looking at those reports and saying, wait a minute, what happened to the starvation? It's not to say Palestinians aren't suffering. There's a terrible war there. But the specific allegation that Israel is intentionally starving Palestinians is the language that was used. And that's a war crime. And there, Israel needs to be punished. And the purpose of the reports were to say to the United States, on the basis of US law, the American government cannot allow Israel to receive weapons. And that was used to withhold weapons from Israel. It turned out to be completely false claims, one of many examples, which should set off a lot of alarms that said, these NGO claims are not reliable. They're ideological, they're spin, they're based on evidence of Palestinian eyewitnesses or on false statistics and data which doesn't take into account all sorts of alternative, different claims that are made that can be documented. And that's a very serious problem that NGOs need to be confronted with.
There seems to be a similarity, or at least I'm drawing a parallel, between media reports early in the war, for example, that Israel had bombed Al-Shifa hospital and killed 500 people. And then that media report was out there and people went running with it and everyone believed it, that Israel had intentionally struck this hospital. Of course, we later come to learn that, first of all, it was a rocket coming from Hamas. Second of all, it didn't land on the hospital. It landed in the parking lot. And third of all, maybe 50 people were killed, not 500. But by the time that true information came out, nobody really cared anymore. And it seems like it's the same thing. Like, right, I'm also aware that we're not hearing the starving. I haven't been hearing the starving claim lately. But no one is really thinking about the fact that this claim was made forcefully and repeatedly by reputable organizations, and that there were consequences, actual consequences to those claims, and what we do with that information. What do you think, like, why? Why are people, including government officials and journalists and academics, resistant to integrating new information into their understanding of the situation?
The perception of Israel, the image of Israel, over at least the last 25, 30 years, has been entirely manipulated to make Israel the world's greatest violator of human rights, of international law. Whatever you can imagine Israel might be, anybody might be guilty of, we're going to pin it on Israel. In some ways, I compare this to the great lie, that Nazi propaganda. I don't like to use the Nazi analogy, but situations are always different. But repeating the great lie over and over again, and having it done by organizations that are seen as nonpartisan, above politics, neutral, accurate, experts, all of those things, moral, based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which grew out of the Holocaust, 1948, the Genocide Convention. It's just those, there's no history of questioning what should be a fundamental process. I can go back at least to 2002, right? So we're talking about 23 years ago now. What was called the Jenin massacre. There were a series of terrible suicide bombings in Israel. Israeli military went into the center in Jenin, where the refugee camp, where these so-called refugee camp, there are no refugees, where the suicide bombs and the bombers were prepared. And immediately you have an Amnesty spokesperson getting on television. I saw it BBC, CNN, we documented it as one of the first things NGO Monitor did, I think before we were called NGO Monitor. Israel committed a massacre, and you have Palestinian officials. And that becomes part of the term folklore is a very mild term, the great lie. Already back then, Israel committed a massacre, war crimes, all of that language. And then you go through war after war.